Welcome you to the second of our Morris Media and Society Lecture Series events. Our guest is going to speak for about 45-50 minutes and then give you an opportunity for Q&A, so get those sharp, barbed presidential election campaign questions ready. It is my very great pleasure to welcome Rocky Anderson back home. He was born in Logan and grew up less than half mile from here up the canyon. He was just remembering how friggin' cold it is here. But we're glad to have you back to Utah State University, sponsored by the JCOM department with help from the Department of Political Science and our student chapter of the Public Relations Student Society of America. So today, with 11 days left before the election, the 212 presidential campaign comes to Logan for the first time. I've got to say that I've got to think ourselves very lucky to have Rocky Anderson here. I was scrolling through the tube the other night, and I saw him with Larry King, and I don't know where you were on C-SPAN, Chicago?
Yes, Chicago.
In Chicago. So here he is straight from Larry King in Chicago to come to the Eccles Conference Center on Utah State University campus. Rocky is candidate, as you know, for President of the United States. He is the co-founder of the Justice Party. And he's going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly, the media in an age of mass deception. I'm sure I don't know what he's talking about there, so we'll have to ask. Surely this is an apt topic for a presidential campaign year, and especially for this presidential campaign. He's best known in Utah as the mayor of Salt Lake City from 2000 to 2008. He also founded and serves as executive director of High Road for Human Rights, a national grassroots activist organization aimed at engaging citizens in defense of human rights. As mayor of Salt Lake, Rocky attracted national attention as a champion for various causes, including climate protection, immigration policy, criminal justice reform, LGBT rights, and the end of the war on drugs. He's an early and outspoken opponent of the Iraq War. In 2011, Anderson left the Democratic Party in disgust. He said, and I quote, "The Constitution has been eviscerated while Democrats have stood by with nary a whimper. It is a gutless, unprincipled party bought and paid for by the same interests that buy and pay for the Republican Party." With that rather soft-spoken introduction, please help me welcome back home to Utah, to Logan and to Utah State, Rocky Anderson.
Well, thank you. I'm oftentimes asked, as you might imagine, when I go around the country, you really were elected mayor of Salt Lake City, not once, but twice, saying the kinds of things that I do, but I learned growing up here in Logan and with my background that we all ought to stand up against wrongdoing when we see it, and we shouldn't shirk away. We've only got one go-around, and we've got to do all we can to take on wrongdoing and try to do the best we can for those who are in need, who are vulnerable. And I wasn't going to do a big campaign speech today. Actually, I thought it might be most appropriate to take a hard look at mass deception in this country, because I think in large part we are where we are in this nation, both with the greatest disparity in wealth and income that at any time since the 1920s, with the fraud on Wall Street, the way that our government has caved to Wall Street, when they've made out like bandits with deregulation and the repeal of Glass-Steagall and all, and leaving so many students with horrendous tuition debt. We should never be in this position. Our young people should never be in the position of basically indentured servants. But that's what's happened. When I went to college, it took on average 200 hours of work to pay one's tuition off. Now it's on average 2,000 hours for students. We have not been served by our politicians, by the two political parties that have basically put our government up for sale to the highest bidders. Why is it now that student debt is deemed by Congress to be non-dischargeable in bankruptcy? It's because it wasn't students that went back and contributed to these folks' campaigns. It was the bankers that have made out unbelievably with these government-guaranteed student tuition programs. So we all need to stand up. We need to stand up against the imperial presidency. And when you hear that word, that's exactly what we've got. We're on the road toward totalitarianism with the Bush and the Obama administrations that have concentrated so much dictatorial power within the presidency. Now, when President Obama came in, I think a lot of us thought that it was going to be different. In fact, it's gotten worse. I don't think a Republican president, I don't think President Bush could have gotten away with asking for and then signing into law a provision allowing our government to round people up and imprison them without charges, without a trial, without legal representation, without the right of habeas corpus. And the students in here today, most of you, have come of age these last 12 years. The nation that you've come to know is so vastly different than what this nation was from its very founding until the Bush and the Obama administrations. It's never been the case that this country engaged in torture or tolerated torture as a matter of official policy until the last 12 years. And although President Obama said, okay, there won't be any more torture on my watch, one of the first things he said after being elected is, and here's from a lawyer, a constitutional lawyer no less, somebody that's supposed to stand for the rule of law. He said, as to these people who violated not only our international treaty obligations, but our own domestic laws, which make it a federal felony to engage in or authorize torture, he said, let's just look the other way. His words were, we'll just look forward and not look backwards. That's a complete undermining, a complete betrayal of the rule of law. He said the same thing about those who had illegally spied on American citizens. And in fact, when he was in the United States Senate, he voted to give retroactive immunity for telecommunication companies because they spent millions upon millions of dollars in this lobbying blitz to get Congress to hand them immunity for their criminal conduct. I don't think any of you would be able to get, no matter the justice of your cause, would be able to get the United States Congress to let you off the hook if you committed a federal felony. So we have two categories of people in this country, a two-tiered system of justice, a two-tiered financial system. And in large part, that has been enabled not only by a very corrupt political system, an electoral system where the Republicans and Democrats have a stranglehold now, keeping independent voices out, but it is because of a media that has lulled the American people along, making it seem as if the only choices are from these two parties. I mean, listen to these debates. What did they argue about? Mitt Romney said that he's going to really increase military spending. And then President Obama says, well, I've increased military spending these last 4 years. Mitt Romney says we're going to drill more and more, depend more and more on fossil fuels for our electricity needs. Nobody said the words climate change. Did you notice that throughout all of these debates? The words climate change never were mentioned, and yet that is going to be the greatest crisis you all face in your lives and what your children are going to be facing. There will be hundreds of millions of environmental refugees, the oceans rising, the glaciers melting, people without water resources, major droughts, devastating floods. And the national security concerns, even back in 2004, a report issued by the Pentagon said this will be the most destabilizing, will have the most destabilizing impact throughout the world. It's a greater security threat by far than terrorism, and yet not one word in these debates. So the media is largely responsible. They either don't treat these issues, or when they treat climate change, you'll notice they treat it, they say, well, on the one hand, but on the other hand, because there are a couple of percentage of scientists who disagree, so they make it seem like this is some kind of scientific question that's still up for grabs, when in fact the vast majority of scientists, the overwhelming consensus is that it's happening. And this, by the way, is not only the International Panel on Climate Change, the largest scientific collaboration of all time, but every nation science academy saying that climate change is happening, the Earth's temperature is warming up. I mean, who could argue against that when you see all the glaciers in Glacier National Park melting? All of them will be gone by the middle of the century. The ice cap melting at faster rates than any of the climate models ever indicated. But it's happening, and they all agree, because of our conduct. The burning of fossil fuels and the destruction of forests. It's because of what we're doing, and this could be turned around if we had decent leadership. To get decent leadership, there's got to be a public call for them to act, and for there to be a public call, we have to have the information. It's got to come from the media, and the media has let the people of this nation down in remarkable ways, and not only in this area, but just about everything else, including the wars, including our human and civil rights violations. How many of you know how many hundreds of civilians, innocent men, women, and children, in Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, Afghanistan have been killed by unmanned drones? And yet the President of the United States brags by leaking information of the media that he takes personal part in deciding to engage in these killings so he can look tough with regard to the so-called terrorists. Who wouldn't be a terrorist if we had unmanned drones being controlled by another nation, coming over our cities and killing our mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, our children, killing people at funerals, killing people at wedding parties? We're seeing such a massive transformation in this country now in terms of the absolute disregard for the most essential human and civil rights, and then domestically with regard to our economy. Again, never as great a disparity between a very small, elite, wealthy class and the rest of us in terms of both income and wealth. 1% in this country own 42% of the wealth. It's never been like this, again, since the Gilded Age, the extended Gilded Age, going through the 1920s. We saw for 35 years a really healthy, vibrant, strong middle class, strong economy where there was real opportunity, where people that got a higher education knew there were good jobs waiting for them, that they could plan on a great future, not worried for the rest of their lives about student debt or whether they were going to be able to have a decent income and be able to have their own homes and provide for their families and help their own children with building their lives in the future. That's all been undercut in this country in dramatic ways, and we're hearing it all over this country. When I see a young woman coming up to me in Berkeley with tears in her eyes, a young African-American woman, she said, because of the student debt that I accrued because I wanted a good education. I took out money so I could pay tuition, so I could go out and get a good job. Now I'm doing volunteer work so I can add it to my resume because I can't find a decent job, and I have to tell my daughter who's in high school I'm not going to be able to help her with her tuition, and I don't have a chance of ever buying my own home because of this crushing debt that I have and the lack of opportunities. We can do so much better than this in our country with good leadership, and it's going to take a people's movement. It's not going to happen in any one election. In fact, it never happens with elected officials. Progressive movements, when we see things going better for people, whether it's women's suffrage, whether it's civil rights movement, whether it's a labor movement, they all happen because people organized at the grassroots level and they wouldn't let up. They made it clear that they were not going away. And so those in Congress, those in the White House, jumped on board and they followed the true leaders. And the true leaders were people like you and me, people at the grassroots. And with that leadership and with our citizenship comes a responsibility and a grand opportunity to be engaged citizens who can bring about that kind of change. So with those prefatory comments, I'm going to do this presentation. It was prepared some time ago. I've made some changes to bring it up to date. I forgot to take out the mayor of Salt Lake City part here. But imagine, I actually did this presentation in preparation as a keynote address to editors from about 20 different newspapers. I was asked by the editor of the Salt Lake Tribune to give this presentation to folks who were affiliated with Dean Singleton's newspapers. And I said, you really don't want me to do this. I'm going to sort of spoil the mood down there. And she said, no, we really want to hear from you. And I did it. Nobody got up and walked out. And in fact, at the end of this presentation, people were lined up to talk to me afterwards. These were all editors, associate editors of major newspapers around the country. And what I heard repeatedly from them is how important they thought this message was and how let down they are, how embarrassed, some of them use that word, embarrassed they were at what their profession has done to this country. So the news media in this country has a responsibility unlike that imposed on any institution. Reporters are entrusted with finding and providing the information that political leaders, businesses, and individuals use to make informed, autonomous decisions. Voters are disempowered to the extent they are not provided truthful, unbiased information. Our democracy depends upon an informed citizenry, and our democracy is denigrated, truly debased, whenever we are manipulated or ill-informed through false, biased, or incomplete information. The journalism profession provides the information that forms the bedrock of our democratic system. Without accurate reporting, we can all fall prey to abuses of power by governments and corporations and by the media itself. Many, perhaps most journalists, take this incredible responsibility to heart, working hard to find out the facts and to convey them with integrity to the public. However, there are some, I would say many, unfortunately, who betray their profession and thereby betray all of us by failing to uncover the truth and misleading the reading, watching, and listening public. Many journalists, starting from the premise that absolute truth is unknowable, conclude that objectivity cannot be a legitimate goal of journalism. This often leads to what I've called a stenographer style of reporting, where the various positions on a given issue are dutifully recorded, but no effort is made to investigate and learn the real state of affairs. And I've seen this most recently and most blatantly in connection with climate change, where they'll say, this person says X, this person says Y, and then they leave it at that. So what's conveyed to the reader is, oh, there's disagreement among the scientific community, so I'll wait until we find a consensus. It's been absolutely irresponsible and incredibly damaging reporting with phenomenal consequences in terms of what's happening not only in our region, and the impacts have been dramatic even here statewide and regionally throughout the Intermountain West, but of course the impacts worldwide because we are the ones burning most of the fossil fuels and failing to provide the crucial international leadership on climate change. Truth and objectivity were not always preoccupations of journalism. During the early years in America, newspapers didn't even pretend to be objective, but everybody knew they were owned by the parties or manipulated by the parties. So when you bought a newspaper, you knew you were getting that biased point of view. Party ownership of newspapers led to extremely nasty campaigns. The things that were said then were unbelievably vicious in comparison even with what we see now. Not afraid to venture into the personal, for instance, they made an issue of Jefferson's affair with one of his slaves and claimed that he would legalize prostitution. They also charged that Jefferson promoted adultery, incest, and the spearing of children. One newspaper summed up the case against Jefferson by arguing that he represented, and this was verbatim out of one of those newspapers back in those days, that he represented cutthroats who walk in rags and sleep amidst filth and vermin. So when we lament the kind of dialogue we see today, I take some heart in that because even our local newspapers haven't said those things about me yet. Reading party newspapers before the election of 1876, one would have been led to believe that the choice was between an alcoholic, syphilitic con artist, Samuel Tilden, and a man described as being so vulgar he robbed corpses on the battlefield during the Civil War and once shot a gun at his own mother. They were describing Rutherford B. Hayes. Party ownership of newspapers continued until the late 19th century. Just got ahead of myself. During the Jacksonian era, however, the emergency of the penny press revolutionized journalism and signaled the beginning of a concern for journalistic objectivity. The penny press, as they called it, distinguished itself by claiming a measure of independence from institutional or party affiliation. One of the reasons I think this history is so important is to consider that in the beginning they were out there. They made it very clear that they were biased, and you knew you were getting a party position. Then with the penny press, there was this claim to objectivity, and yet what we're seeing today, and you'll see this, is a claim to objectivity by our newspapers, but unbelievable bias and mass deception. Journalists explicitly served as agents of American government propaganda during World War I. For example, James Keeley, the managing editor of the Chicago Tribune and publisher of the Chicago Herald, was the U.S. representative on the Inter-Allied Board, which distributed information favorable to the Allied cause. The Committee on Public Information, which President Woodrow Wilson created in 1917, employed many journalists and recruited 75,000 four-minute men who delivered pro-war speeches in public places. A prominent publicist of the period wrote, "It was the astounding success of propaganda during the war which opened the eyes of the intelligent few in all departments of life to the possibilities of regimenting the public mind." So government set out with propaganda to regiment the public mind for the cause of our government's engagement in World War I. Since World War I, the federal government has considered managing the news one of its basic tasks. And never forget this because it's happening to this very day. The government has lied to protect its interests and defended its right to lie, often on the basis of national security. Many journalists were shocked when the Eisenhower administration repeatedly lied about the existence of the U-2 spy program. Journalists were also outraged at the Kennedy administration's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis, particularly how the administration sought to mislead journalists. Author Sylvester, Pentagon spokesman under Kennedy, defended the government's actions, asserting that, as he put it, in the kind of world we live in, the generation of news by actions taken by the government becomes one weapon in a strained situation. The results justify the methods we used, he said. Ben Bradley, executive editor of the Washington Post, throughout the 1970s and 80s, once remarked that his paper had been, and these were his words, had been kinder to President Reagan than any president I can remember since I've been at the Post. Reagan's affability and telegenic personality, combined with a ruthless public relations machine, created media coverage that was disproportionately sympathetic to Reagan's views. And one thing I would highly recommend, a book that spells it all out so beautifully, and it would be as appropriate today as it was then, is the book by Mark Hertsgaard on Bended Knee, about how President Reagan got away virtually with murder, with our media, and with misleading the American people by engaging in a number of strategies to compromise the objectivity of our media. Today, as the federal government has grown larger and more powerful than ever, journalistic integrity and fidelity to the truth are more difficult to maintain. This is especially true considering the Bush and Obama's administrations' fixation on national security and their lack of openness. President Obama promised transparency 4 years ago, and his has probably been the least transparent, most secretive administration in history, and more whistleblowers, like Bradley Manning, have been prosecuted for espionage during this administration, for getting the truth out to the American people, for exposing crimes and lies by our government and our agents. More of them have been prosecuted during the last 4 years of the Obama administration than by every other administration combined in our nation's history. Then, of course, there's the corporatization and centralization of U.S. media. While news organizations are threatened through the expanding reaches of the national security state, they also face the challenge of increasing corporate centralization and interlocking corporate relationships. There are actually 118 people comprising the boards of directors of the 10 largest media organizations, and many of these people come from the corporate sector. Now, if General Electric owns a huge media organization, as they do NBC, and if the Washington Post has a board member who sits on the corporate board of GE Investments, there are these interlocking directorships. Is it any wonder that we're not hearing on the mainstream media about what General Electric is up to? For instance, the fact that it pays billions of dollars in taxes in other countries and pays zero corporate taxes in the United States. You're not going to hear that through the media, that they own or where they have members of boards of directors. Despite these pressures, many, if not most, journalists take truthfulness to heart and struggle to the best of their abilities to accurately and completely convey to news readers, viewers, and listeners. The finest reporting in journalism's history has resulted from this imperative, particularly when combined with a quest for justice. So we've seen some great examples of this with certainly during the Watergate episode with Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. They set a great example for investigative reporting. Jack Anderson, who grew up in Salt Lake City, was one of the great investigative journalists of all time, exposing the savings and loan scandal, J. Edgar Hoover's ties to the mafia, and the Iran-Contra scandal. Without him and that kind of reporting, we never would have known. But much of that is absent in today's media, and we're getting exactly the opposite. The media coverage during the death squad and Contra days in Central America, and again in the context of the Iraq invasion and occupation, certainly bring to mind George Orwell's quotation of Hilaire Belloc, who wrote, "You cannot hope to bribe or twist, thank God, the British journalist. But seeing what the man will do, unbribed, there is no reason to." In other words, most of them don't need to be bribed. They don't need to be paid off, although as you'll see later on, some of them have been, because they fall so complacently in line with the government's accounts. They oftentimes look like the bulletin board for the press releases from our government without looking into the stories, without getting after the truth. So we, the American voters, are left with the lies. We're left with the misinformation, and we aren't informed voters if all we have is this spoon-fed so-called journalism, which is really propaganda from our media. The war in Iraq provides many startling examples of the media's disregard for the truth. Much of the media's willingness to complacently serve as the bulletin board for any fabrications provided by the Bush administration, its failure to inquire about several of the Bush administration's claims proffered as justification for our invasion and occupation of Iraq, and the media's failure to convey to the public highly relevant information that was known, allowed our nation to be taken to war with an incredibly ill-informed public, a public that may well have prevented the war had it been provided the truth by our news media. But even now, years later, many of the misrepresentations repeated by the media persist in much of the public's mind. The common wisdom now is, unfortunately, based on so much of the misinformation we were provided during those years. And one thing that was made clear is that so many journalists, after 9/11 and the horrible tragedy and the sense that we're all in this together and we all need to fight against what happened together, led our journalists to a point where they didn't question. They were afraid to question. They were afraid to stand up against the official lie. George Bush stated at one point with Tony Blair from Camp David that the International Atomic Energy Agencies had found that Iraq was only 6 months away from building nuclear weapons. And that was dutifully reported by the media, a media where very few people even bothered to look at the IAEA reports. And if they had, they would have found that there was never a report that said that. In fact, they said just the opposite, that there was no evidence that Iraq was building up a nuclear capability. So there were those who said, I'm an American first and a journalist second. That seemed to be what was going on at the time in our nation's media, and it was a huge betrayal. It led to a huge betrayal of the American people. To strongly identify with one's status as an American is easily confused with conforming to the government's interpretation of what being American means. The Bush and Obama administrations have been keenly interested in promoting a vision of American identity or patriotism as uncritical acceptance of the government's policies and practices. These administrations have been keen to use this conception of identity as a cudgel against dissent, especially when the administration's actions abuse the public trust. All too often, the media has simply taken the government at its word and actively cultivated a mentality of my country, right or wrong. One of the most startling examples of the media's complicity in promoting the Iraq War on false pretenses was the reporting on pre-war so-called intelligence. The media's uncritical acceptance of the evidence proffered by the Bush administration that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction fueled the administration's case for war. Unbelievably, many media outlets underreported or did not report at all the fact that some of the most central claims for the administration's call for war evidence were revealed to be based on forged documents before the war began. In a State of the Union address in 2003, President Bush claimed that Saddam Hussein had sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa.
The International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed in the 1990s that Saddam Hussein had an advanced nuclear weapons development program, had a design for a nuclear weapon, and was working on 5 different methods of enriching uranium for a bomb. The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa.
The Bush administration did not disclose, however, that the intelligence agency under the State Department, the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, deemed this very claim highly dubious. That was in its intelligence reports that were provided to the president and that were available to members of Congress. Those were the words they used. What President Bush, you just heard him say, was highly dubious. The contention made by President Bush was based solely on documents obtained from Italian sources, according to the Silberman-Raab report, and was key to the Bush administration's case for war. President Bush made this claim in spite of requests from the CIA to remove the reference to the alleged uranium purchase. The agency felt there was not enough evidence to support that claim. So on March 7th, 2003, 10 days before our invasion of Iraq, Mohammed al-Baradi, who is director of the International Atomic Energy Agency, announced that his agency had determined that the documents on which the claim was based were crude forgeries. Apparently, it had taken only hours for the IAEA experts to conclude the documents were not authentic. Using little more than Google searches, they realized that the officials from Niger, whose names and titles were listed on the documents, did not hold those positions on the date of the documents. So the news of the forgeries was mentioned the next day in a few national newspapers. The accounts were buried in the middle of news articles, the headlines of which did not even make reference to the forgery, or in small, inconspicuous articles. This wasn't on the front page headlines. That the major case being made by President Bush was now completely obliterated by the finding that these documents were forgeries. The accounts, if they appeared at all, were in small articles like this with headlines that didn't have anything to do with the forgeries. And then there was almost no mention whatsoever about the forgeries in the later issues of these newspapers. So we took a look at our daily newspapers. When did this coverage, if you were relying upon our daily newspapers, would you have known the truth about these false claims that form the basis for the case for going to war against Iraq, and the fact that these forgeries were found out 10 days before the invasion? What would you, as an inquiring citizen, somebody who wants to be an informed citizen, have known if you were relying on our media? Well, one of our local daily newspapers, the Deseret Morning News, did not include any mention of the story on March 8th, choosing to focus instead on cattle grazing and missionary gaffes. In fact, no mention of the forgery appeared in the Deseret News until June 29th, almost 4 months after al-Baradi's disclosure of the forgery. in a syndicated column by Daniel Shore. The forgery did not appear in a news piece until July 10th in a story about Bush's African policy. The story did not run as a feature until July 12th, when it was downplayed by the headline, CIA Takes Fall for N, meaning nuclear, miscue. In short, the Deseret News failed entirely to report the forgery until 4 months after the war began and 1 month after President Bush had declared mission accomplished. The day after El Baradei's disclosure about the forgery, Salt Lake City's major daily newspaper, the Salt Lake Tribune, led with a picture of the Senate Majority Leader rubbing the head of the Minority Leader, along with the story headlined as if out of Alice in Wonderland, Pentagon's new openness may be challenging for today's reporters. When it did finally run a story on the forgery on July 12, 2003, almost 4 months after the initial invasion of Iraq, it downplayed it with the headline, CIA Takes Blame for Iraq Snafu. Incredibly, accounts of what had been disclosed 4 months earlier do not mention when the forgeries were discovered or why the news media had been so derelict in reporting on the baselessness of a claim that served as one of President Bush's major justifications for commencing and rushing into this illegal, outrageous, tragic war. The news media also blindly accepted Secretary of State Powell's presentation on Iraq's alleged weapons programs before the UN Security Council. Most of you probably remember when Colin Powell went before the UN, laid out his case. Well, the Deseret News published a front page article about that under the headline, Irrefutable, Undeniable. That's what we were led to believe. Do you know what Colin Powell has since said about his own statement before the United Nations? He said it was all wrong. He was misled, it was erroneous, and it was his life's greatest regret. And yet this is the kind of uncritical reporting we received, and this wasn't unique. I'm not just picking on Utah's newspapers. This was happening all over the country. The Salt Lake Tribune editorialized against those who urged more caution in proceeding against war. There are a lot of people around the world saying, let the weapons inspectors finish their job. And yet what we were being spoon-fed by media all over this country is we can't wait any longer. This is irrefutable. Colin Powell said it after all. The New York Times helped lead us toward that war with horrendous reporting by Judith Miller. She was getting documents from the White House, basically repeating what was in those documents as if they were fact. And then on the Sunday news programs, Dick Cheney would appear holding up the New York Times as evidence that what he was saying was true after all, because it was in the New York Times. The circularity was just amazing. And the New York Times, to its credit, apologized editorially for misleading the American people. Our own newspapers have never done that. Consider further the nonsense about Jessica Lynch. Do you all remember the stories about this heroine, Jessica Lynch? Published by the Washington Post and repeated throughout this country. First published under the headline, "She was fighting to the death." That was the headline. It was repeated by news outlets, including our own newspapers. The story, based on, quote, information from an unnamed Army source, a source that incredibly remains unnamed to this day, was that Jessica Lynch, a supply clerk in Iraq, was ambushed by Iraqi forces, and she continued firing at the Iraqis. Was ambushed by Iraqi forces, and she continued firing at the Iraqis even after she sustained multiple gunshot wounds. This was all verbatim, taking out of the Washington Post. According to the article, quote, Lynch was also stabbed when Iraqi forces closed in on her position. Finally, the article concluded with the heroic ending stating, Lynch's rescue was a classic special operations raid with U.S. commandos in Black Hawk helicopters engaging Iraqi forces on their way in and out of the medical compound. What was the truth? Jessica Lynch was not shot. She was not stabbed. She did not engage in a battle with the Iraqis. In fact, she never got off a shot. The Iraqis who had been guarding the hospital where Lynch was located had left by the time the U.S. forces came storming in. There was no engagement of Iraqi forces at the hospital. So after the truth came out, the Washington Post's ombudsman, Michael Gettler, made the compelling point by asking, what were the motivations and even the identities of the leakers and sustainers of this myth? And why didn't reporters dig deeper into it more quickly? Gettler then offered this very disturbing answer to his own question. This, he wrote, was the single most memorable story of the war, and it had a unique propaganda value. It was false, but it didn't get knocked down until it didn't matter quite so much. So that's what we were being spoon-fed by our media. And amazingly enough, the Army propagandist who gave that to the Washington Post has never been identified by the Post, even though they admit it was a completely false story dished out to the American people. National news media continued to lend support to the Bush administration's discredited claims about the war in Iraq. An exchange in May between Donald Rumsfeld and Ray McGovern during a speech Rumsfeld made in Atlanta was covered by some reporters at CNN in a manner obviously sympathetic to Rumsfeld. Now remember, Ray McGovern had been a CIA analyst, and he knew what he was talking about. One of the few courageous people to stand up and ask for the truth.
One unrolled a banner reading, quote, guilty of war crimes. Another stood up and turned his back during the speech. And yet another accused Donald Rumsfeld of lying. Today, the defense secretary gave a speech in Atlanta. One of the most sharp-tongued questioners identified himself as a former CIA analyst.
Atlanta, September 27, 2002, Donald Rumsfeld said, and I quote, there is bulletproof evidence of links between Al-Qaeda and the government of President Saddam Hussein. Was that a lie, Mr. Rumsfeld, or was that manufactured somewhere else? Because all of my CIA colleagues disputed that, and so did the 9/11 Commission. And so I would like to ask you to be upfront with the American people. Why did you lie to get us into a war that was not necessary, that has caused these kinds of casualties? Why?
Well, first of all, I haven't lied. I did not lie then. Colin Powell didn't lie. He spent weeks and weeks with the Central Intelligence Agency people and prepared a presentation that I know he believed was accurate. And he presented that to the United Nations. The president spent weeks and weeks with the Central Intelligence people. And he went to the American people and made a presentation. I'm not in the intelligence business. They gave the world their honest opinion. It appears that there were not weapons of mass destruction there.
You said you knew where they were.
I did not. I said I knew where suspect sites were, and we were just...
You said you knew where they were, near Tikrit, near Baghdad, and north, east, south, and west of there. Those are your words.
My words were that... No, wait a minute, let me...
Okay, I'm gonna stop there. I've just been told that you're gonna be leaving for class here shortly. I'll summarize this. It came back to Wolf Blitzer. He did his fact checking. He said, well, in fact, Rumsfeld had said that he knew beforehand where those weapons of mass destruction were, and he identified the places. And then Wolf Blitzer went on to call what Ray McGovern, this courageous man who stood up to point out that we had all been lied to, called what Ray McGovern had done a anti-Rumsfeld rant. Then Paula Zahn interviewed Ray McGovern, and you know what her question of Ray McGovern was? Do you have an axe to grind against Rumsfeld? That was what we were being fed by our nation's media. And it went on and on like that. Nobody was pointing out that it was because of these lies that we ended up engaging in this horrendous war of aggression that ended up causing 1 million Iraqi deaths and such tragedy for so many of our service people. So we have a number of other examples like this, not only during the Bush administration, but during the Obama administration. The truth is being kept from us. What do you hear about Bradley Manning? Do you hear about the fact that he disclosed the murder, the war crimes committed that we never would have known about? Video footage of people being mowed down. They were innocent citizens, including Reuters journalists in Baghdad. Nobody being held accountable for that. And yet, the person who disclosed it, if he did disclose it, Bradley Manning, through WikiLeaks, is being held and tried for espionage. He's considered a traitor for giving we, the American people, the truth. I think he's an absolute hero for doing it. And I think that whoever's president of the United States should be pardoning Bradley Manning, and we ought to be holding those accountable who committed the crimes that he's disclosed. So as you can see, we need to be very critical, and don't get so discouraged that you don't read the newspapers. Read everything you can get your hands on. But we have amazing resources through the internet. We have people that are analyzing, who are reporting the truth. Oftentimes that's about the only place you're going to get it. People like Glenn Greenwald that do such a great job. TruthDig. I highly recommend these outlets, salon.com, because they get behind what it is that you're reading in the mainstream media. So let me just sum up by saying, finding out the truth is all of our responsibilities. We can't just be spoon-fed this propaganda. We've got to be engaged, informed citizens, and that's the only way we're going to see things turn around in this country. It's the only way we're going to stop the kinds of empire building and the atrocities being committed throughout the world, and where we're going to find real justice, including environmental justice, by our own government. So with that, thank you very much, and we'll open up for questions and answers.
I know that some of you have classes at 11:30, and that's your side. Who has a question?
And by the way, this is open to anything. We are still running presidential campaigns, so feel free to ask anything.
Hi, my name is Ryan Cunningham. I work with Utah Public Radio, where you used to go to church.
Right.
I was wondering what you thought of the prevalence of fact-checking websites like PolitiFact, and I think there are a couple other ones. What do you think of that?
I think fact-checking by PolitiFact and others has actually been a great thing, and it's helped generate a lot of discussion. You know, as I said, we've been spoon-fed so much misinformation. I think it's great that people are finally focusing on fact-checking. I was quite amazed the other night that after I was involved in this debate, and I pointed out the Pentagon's concerns in terms of national security in the context of climate change, somebody reported, well, the fact-checkers were probably not paying attention to this debate because it's unlikely that the Pentagon would express these concerns today. If they had done their own fact-checking, they would have seen absolutely there were those Pentagon reports, and there are clearly those national security concerns as well as concerns about stability around the world because of climate change. But yeah, I think we should all pay attention to fact checkers, but also, you know, you get so much garbage over the internet. I'm still seeing that Warren Buffett has said all these things that Congress ought to be doing. All you need to do is plug that into Snopes.com. All these urban myths that are going around, they do a really good analysis of whether they're truthful or not. And by the way, all that stuff that they're saying Warren Buffett said, he never said it. You'll find that on Snopes. And by the way, that was where the radio station's located, that Quonset hut, when I was a little boy growing up Mormon in Logan, that was our ward house. That's where we went to church in those days.
Hi, is this on? First of all, I want to thank you so much for coming here. It's hard to get alternative views, and I agree that these two parties have a stranglehold on things. It seems to me, and I think this is what a lot of your presentation was pointing out, that our media has really largely gone in favor of being an entertainment outlet. And without going into that too deeply, sort of what do you see as the roadmap for getting media, particularly journalism, back towards what was one time considered sort of the fourth branch of government, a critical part of our democracy?
Yeah, I'm glad you posed it that way, because now instead of being the fourth estate, it's more like just another direct branch of government in many respects, as you've seen here. I think we need, even if it took subsidies for independent media, we ought to have publicly owned airwaves that are actually run by the public. We ought to have more community run stations. I think that if we leave it to the mainstream media, we are in big trouble. And when you've got papers like the Washington Post doing what they did with Jessica Lynch, by the way, this isn't just in the context of war and peace. During the Katrina hurricane, do you remember all those stories? It was so racist about mostly blacks shooting at rescue helicopters. All these people were being raped and killed. They found people, dead bodies in a freezer, babies killed. Do you all remember that reporting that was coming out? None of it was true. There wasn't a word of truth to it. But the false reports about shooting at rescue helicopters actually held up rescue operations because they were getting that information through the media. So we know that there's a huge problem. I don't mean to keep repeating that. But we need to recognize that, and I think in the day of the internet, we've got more sources of information, but it seems people are worse informed than they used to be when we had trusted sources of information. And I just think that we all ought to be raising hell about it. When we see misinformation, we ought to be calling our newspapers on it, our television stations. And it really does work. During the 80s, when I was real involved in opposing U.S. foreign policy in Central America, we just got a group of us. We didn't have any organization we were working through. We were just upset about it. Went down, talked to the editorial board at the Salt Lake Tribune. We organized a trip to Nicaragua. They called us and they sent their editorial editor to go down with us, and later Channel 2 sent a three-person news team on another trip with us. They came back and did these major series on what was really happening in that country. So they do respond. Your local media will respond if you go to them and you point out that we're just being spoon-fed the same false information. But I do think we need more of a commitment by our government, not in having government-run media, but in helping subsidize independent media that isn't sponsored and controlled by the corporate sector, because that's exactly what we're getting now. John Nichols makes a really strong case for this. If you want to look into that further, he's written a lot for The Nation magazine and about this very issue.
Hi, Mayor Anderson. My name's Seth. Kind of going back to your opening comments about progressive movements and how we need to get those going. Just like with the fact that the media, if they report at all, any dissenting or progressive voices seem to get pushed to the back of the newspaper. How do you hope to get your views into the forefront and to have people start paying attention and really get your party and your voice heard?
That is a great question. Actually, things are really picking up now in terms of coverage. We just had a debate the other night in Chicago. First of all, I was on Amy Goodman's program in connection with all three presidential debates, along with Jill Stein of the Green Party. And they did this expanded debate. It's never been done before, where they would show Romney and Obama, and then they'd stop the video and they would come to us as if we were involved in the debate, and we got to give our responses. And that got out to hundreds of thousands of people. It was not only on several television channels, but also online. And then Free and Equal Elections the other night in Chicago held a debate with 4 third-party candidates. I was there. Larry King moderated, and it was picked up by C-SPAN, by RT Television, by Al Jazeera, and it was online. And it's the first time I've been called by the Washington Post, by the Boston Globe about what we're doing. And I think we're seeing the stars aligning. The majority of people in polls now are saying they want to see a major third party or independent candidate. Millions of people have left the Republican Democratic parties during the last 4 years. And now there are more people who identify themselves as independents or unaffiliated than there are people who identify themselves as Republicans or Democrats. So we're seeing a huge shift here, but this isn't about winning elections. I mean, eventually that's what we hope to do, but I didn't get into this, and I haven't given the last year of my life, and neither of our volunteers and amazing underpaid, overworked staff members. My time's up. That's Deep Purple's telling me my time's up. But this really is about helping leverage a major people's democratic movement. And across the political spectrum, people are saying we need to get the corrupting influence of money out of our government. We've got to stop having our government up for sale to the highest bidders. And I think that we're seeing this happening. I'm very, very encouraged. But it will only happen if every single one of us become engaged. That doesn't mean you have to run for office. It doesn't mean that you have to go out and camp out with the Occupy movement. But doing what you can in your own way and helping spread the word, that's how these movements prevail. We wouldn't have seen the civil rights movement prevail if we'd left it to elections and people in public office. They ended up getting on board when people took to the streets, organized, and made it clear we're not going to let up until this is changed. And if you people in public office don't get on board, you're going to pay a very heavy political price. So it is about engaged citizenship and about all of us taking part. Isn't that a great opportunity that we can really do that in this country? But also know, along with that opportunity comes a huge responsibility, because if you don't do it, we're just going to keep getting more of the same, and it's going to keep getting worse. The national security state now in this country, it's going to impact every one of us, and I'm afraid it's going to be too late if we don't put an end to it now.
We have time for one more question. Yeah. Oh, all right.
Hi, my name's Julie. I'm a student here. I just had a question. You mentioned that it's important for all of us to seek the truth ourselves. What would you recommend for those, especially here in Utah, where we are surrounded by those who refuse to seek the truth and accept the spoon-fed news media? And it's just very, it's very different from Salt Lake, from Logan. I lived in Salt Lake, and it's a struggle.
Yeah, it is. One thing I found out, especially, there's a lot of research that's been done in recent years by cognitive psychologists and linguists, and I mean, you wonder, like, why when the facts and the evidence are all there as to climate change, let alone evolution, is there such resistance by a huge number of people? And I think we've been going about it all the wrong way. Fred Wagner and I are working on a project now. We've got a climate change declaration. I don't want to have anything to do with it. I don't want any politicians except for doing the work behind the scenes. I want this to come from, and not just scientists, because people don't seem to have all that much respect for scientists. A lot of people, especially, well, the studies have shown people who view themselves as conservatives, they have their own worldview and they have their values, and they filter out all that evidence. They filter out the facts. It's just a matter of psychology. You can't even get upset at them. I've come to terms with this. It's a matter of psychology. You have to deal with it. And to responsibly deal with it, you have to start from that context of values and worldview. And so we're getting religious leaders, we're getting business leaders to sign off on this. And that's a way to bring people along. I sat on the plane the other day with this woman. She was going on, she's a lovely Mormon, Republican woman from, I think, West Valley. And she was telling me how much she loves Senator Hatch and how she still loves George Bush and doesn't understand why I didn't like George Bush. And I just looked at her and I said, let me ask you about your religion and your moral values. I said, I think George Bush had to have been one of the most immoral people living today, and those he surrounded himself with. Look at the pain and the suffering, and he did it all on a pack of lies. And I laid all this out to her. She had no idea. She had never heard any of that. But I put it all in the context of fundamental morality. And you know, we've got to stop butting heads. And we've got to find our common humanity and start from there. You know that on sexual orientation, for instance, it was so easy for people. I grew up in Logan. You know, then it was bigotry toward African Americans in the LDS Church. And it lasted for a long time. And now we're seeing the same bigotry toward members of the LGBT community. And I'm not just saying in the LDS Church, but it's so, and I grew up with that kind of homophobia. But it dissipates, it goes away when people can build those human relationships. You know, whether it's race, religion, sexual orientation that divides us, as soon as you really get to know the other so that you don't think of them as the other anymore, all of that goes away. And if we could recognize how much this team mentality approach to politics is destroying any kind of commitment to principle. I mean, when Democrats are supporting a president who, for the first time in U.S. history, is targeting U.S. citizens for assassination with no semblance of due process, when a Democratic president is sitting around deciding who's going to live and who's going to die as a result of drone strikes, knowing that hundreds, if not thousands, of innocent civilians in these countries are also going to be killed, ratcheting up the hatred and hostility toward the United States. Imagine. I mean, you've got all these Democrats standing up blindly behind him saying, yeah, but, you know, he's our guy, he's on our team, he's got the D on his jersey. They've just totally forfeited any claim to principle. Because if that had been George Bush and Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld sitting around in the Oval Office doing exactly the same thing, going through these baseball card-like biographies of suspected terrorists and saying, let's kill that one, let's kill that one, go into these sovereign nations and attack them, send these bombs down. And they're not that precise. They're killing a lot of innocent people. The latest research shows that 2% of the thousands of people killed by drone strikes have been high-level al-Qaeda operatives. 2%. If these had been Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld doing this, Democrats would have been holding congressional hearings, there would have been congressional subpoenas, people would have been out in the streets. There would have been demonstrations all over this country. And yet when it's our guy, when it's one of us rather than one of them, we line up blindly behind him. So why do I get off on that in connection with these other issues? It's all the same. It's the us versus them. We've got to get beyond it. We've got to find our common humanity, and we've got to stand behind principle if we're ever going to see this turnaround. Thank you.
On behalf of the Department of Journalism and the Morris Media and Society Lecture Series and all of our sponsors, we'd like to thank Rocky for coming out today and making the trip up to Logan. This is a gift for you. And thanks everyone for coming out. We appreciate it. So have a great day.
All right, look at that. Thank you.